I thought I was just defending my first-class seat from a pair of arrogant consultants, but I had actually stumbled into the heart of a dangerous, organized scheme. By the time we reached cruising altitude, I realized that I wasn't just a passenger on a flight to New York. I was the target of a high-stakes trap that threatened to cost me my life. The flight from London to New York was supposed to be the victory lap of my career. I was lounging in seat 1A, the leather cool against my back, sipping a glass of vintage scotch while reviewing the final acquisition paperwork for my latest venture. I had spent 6 months meticulously restructuring a failing logistics giant, turning a dying company into a market leader. Today, I was finally heading to the Big Apple to sign the merger that would solidify my reputation as a venture capitalist who could resurrect anything from the ashes. The cabin was relatively quiet until a couple shoved their way past the flight attendant, practically vibrating with a mix of arrogance and impatience. The man, draped in an Italian suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and the woman, whose designer bags looked heavy enough to tip the scales, didn't even glance at the manifest. They just wanted the view. "Move!" the man barked, not looking down, as if he were addressing a servant rather than a passenger. I looked up from my tablet, my brow arching. I was wearing a simple, comfortable cashmere sweater and jeans, the attire of someone who valued comfort over vanity, which apparently made me invisible to people who gauged worth by gold-plated watch faces. I didn't move. I simply pointed to my boarding pass, tucked into the pocket of the seat in front of me. "I believe there's been a mistake," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is 1A. The woman laughed, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the low hum of the cabin. "Oh, honey, don't play that game. We paid a premium for this row. Our assistant handled it. You're clearly in the wrong place. Maybe row 42 is back there? Don't make us call the staff." I leaned back, unimpressed. "I booked this seat 3 months ago. I suggest you check your tickets before you embarrass yourselves further." The man's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He stepped closer, his presence intended to intimidate. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm here for the merger of the decade. I'm the lead consultant for the firm that just bought out the logistical sector's biggest player. My time is worth more in a single minute than your entire net worth. Get up, or I'll ensure you never fly on this airline again." I stared at him, my mind clicking into place. I recognized the firm. They were a mid-tier consultancy I had brought in to audit the supply chain operations 3 months ago. They were supposed to be the boots on the ground for the merger I was currently finalizing. They were the bottom feeders I had hired to do the grunt work. "You're working for the firm," I said, a small, dangerous smile ghosting my lips. "I am the firm," he spat, "and you're a nobody in a seat you don't belong in. If you don't move, I'll have the captain remove you. I know the CEO of this carrier personally. We're in the same country club." The flight attendant approached, looking frantic as the man continued to loom over me. She started to murmur something about seat adjustments, her eyes darting between my black skin and the couple's entitlement, clearly afraid of the social fallout. I held up a hand, silencing her. "Let's clarify something," I said, standing up slowly. I was a head taller than him, and the way I carried myself seemed to rattle his confidence for a fleeting second. "You're heading to New York to represent a client on a massive acquisition deal?" "Yes," the man scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. "A deal that will make us millions. Now get out of the seat." "What's the name of the company you're representing?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "None of your business," he retorted. I pulled out my phone and tapped a few buttons, pulling up a digital file. I flipped the screen toward him. It was the master contract for the acquisition. My name was at the top, the majority shareholder, the sole investor who had provided the capital to save the very company he was going to pretend to lead. "I'm the person who hired your firm," I said, watching the color drain from his face as he realized exactly whose seat he had tried to steal. "And based on this interaction, I'm wondering if I should even let you off this plane, let alone into my boardroom." He stumbled back, his eyes darting to his wife, who had gone deathly pale. But before he could stutter an apology, I looked toward the front of the cabin. 2 men in sharp, dark suits, men I had requested for security due to the sensitive nature of the deal, were already moving down the aisle, responding to the commotion. They didn't look like flight staff. They looked like professional security detail. And they weren't looking at the couple. They were looking at the man, their eyes cold and focused on his every movement. "Actually," I said, turning to the security team, "it seems there's a problem with the passenger in 1B. He's claiming he's representing me in a professional capacity, but he's acting suspiciously enough that I think we need a formal review of his background before we land." The man's mouth hung open, his hands beginning to shake. He realized that this wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about the fact that he was currently standing on the wrong side of the most powerful person in his industry. And as the security detail closed in, I knew exactly what they were going to find when they looked into his professional history. The security detail didn't hesitate. One of the men, a tall, silent figure with a razor-thin scar near his temple, stepped firmly into the aisle, effectively blocking the couple's path to their own seats. The man's bluster vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. He tried to puff out his chest, but his shoulders hunched inward as the reality of the situation took root. "Sir," the security lead said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of emotion, "we were alerted that there might be a security breach in the first-class cabin. We'll need you to step into the galley for a moment so we can discuss the nature of your, professional credentials." "This is a mistake," the man stammered, his wife clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. He's just a passenger. We're the consultants. We have clearance. You can't do this to us." I leaned back into my seat, crossing my legs and picking up my scotch again. I watched with clinical detachment as the man's facade crumbled. It was fascinating, really, how quickly a person's perceived superiority evaporates the moment they realize they've insulted the hand that feeds them. He had spent the last 2 months sending me glowing status reports, buttering me up in every email, praising my visionary leadership. Little did he know, he'd been speaking to the very man he was currently trying to bully. "Actually," I interjected, my voice calm enough to be heard over the rising panic, "I believe there's more to be found in his luggage than just consultancy reports. While you're at it, I suggest a thorough check of their carry-ons. I've had suspicions about the way their firm handles off-the-books expenses. It would be a shame if they were hiding something that could lead to a massive investigation." The man went deathly silent. His eyes widened, darting toward the overhead bin where his expensive, custom-made leather carry-on was stowed. He didn't just look scared. He looked like a man who knew he was being walked into a trap. The security lead signaled to a flight attendant. "Ma'am, please open bin 1A. "Wait!" the woman shrieked, her voice hitting a panicked register. "You have no right! That's private property. That's a violation of privacy." The security team didn't care about privacy. They lived in a world of compliance and high-stakes risk management. The lead agent pulled the bag down, placed it on the floor, and clicked the locks open. The cabin went deathly silent. Every passenger in the first-class rows was staring, phones out, recording the slow, methodical unfolding of a complete social and professional collapse. The agent pulled out a folder, then a series of encrypted drives, but it was what he found tucked into the inner lining of the bag that changed the atmosphere from an awkward confrontation into something much darker. He pulled out a sealed, vacuum-packed sleeve containing several thick, unmarked envelopes and a stack of passports, not the kind one carries for a business trip. The lead agent looked at me, then back at the man. The air in the cabin shifted, thick with the scent of ozone and impending catastrophe. "Sir," the agent said, his tone turning icy, "these documents don't look like standard consultancy paperwork. And these items? These look like they belong in a file for an internal audit involving a serious organized scheme." The man looked at me, his face a mask of pure terror. He knew. He knew that I hadn't just called security because of a seat dispute. I had set a trap, and he had walked right into it, exposing his own house of cards. "I think you need to explain why a consultant is carrying forged travel documents and evidence of a massive money laundering operation in their carry-on," I said, finally standing up to look him in the eye. "Is this how you conduct your due diligence for my company?" The man opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His wife let out a choked sob. Just as the lead agent reached for his radio to call the authorities at our destination, The intercom flickered to life. The pilot's voice, sounding strained and urgent, cut through the silence of the cabin. "Attention passengers, we have an unexpected situation with our flight plan. Please remain seated and keep your belts fastened. We've just been contacted by the ground. There is an urgent inquiry regarding a passenger manifest, and we are being instructed to divert to an alternate landing site immediately." The plane banked sharply to the left. The man beside me collapsed into his seat, his head in his hands. But the true horror hit me a second later. The flight attendant, who had been standing by the galley, suddenly dropped her service tray. She didn't look at the couple. She looked at me. And she reached into her apron, pulling out something that was definitely not a beverage list. The security team stopped, their hands hovering over their holsters. The plane groaned as the engines throttled down, and I realized that the trap hadn't just been for them. I had been lured into something far, far worse than a corporate disagreement. I wasn't just facing a disgruntled consultant. I was trapped at 30,000 feet with a group that had just realized I was the only person who knew their secret, and they were ready to ensure I never landed. The cabin felt as though the air had been vacuumed out of it, leaving us in a pressurized bubble of suffocating dread. The flight attendant, a woman I had spoken to only moments ago, was now standing with a cold, hollow expression, her hand gripping a concealed device that was clearly meant to do more than open beverage cans. She wasn't an airline employee. She was an operative. And the diversion wasn't a ground control decision. It was a hijacking. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice devoid of its earlier polite cadence. Her gaze flickered toward the security team, then settled on me with predatory precision. "Both of you, keep your hands where I can see them. The flight plan is no longer in the hands of the pilot." The consultant, now sweating so profusely his expensive suit was darkened at the shoulders, looked up, his eyes darting between me and the operative. I didn't know," he stammered, his bravado completely disintegrated. "They told me to carry the bag. They said it was just for the audit. I didn't know you were going to bring security on board." "You were the bait," I said, my voice low and steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands visible on the armrests. My mind was racing, calculating every exit, every possibility. "You thought you were a consultant, but you were just a mule. And now that you've tripped the alarm, you're a liability." The operative shifted, her grip tightening on the device. "You're both liabilities," she confirmed. The security agents, my security, the ones I had trusted with my life, were in a stalemate. The lead agent had his hand on his holster, but he was hesitating. The operative had pulled a second person out from the galley, a man wearing a pilot's uniform that didn't quite fit him, his eyes scanning the cabin for any sign of resistance. "The organization didn't want this kind of attention," the pilot imposter growled, stepping into the aisle. "But since you've already started the investigation, we might as well finish it. We're heading to an airfield that doesn't show up on any commercial radar. Once we land, there will be no more questions, and definitely no more audits." I felt a surge of cold fury. I had spent my life building a legacy, creating something of value, only to be dragged into a shadow war by people who built nothing but destruction. I glanced at the consultant. He was spiraling, his wife hysterical in her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. He had no survival instinct, no tactical value. I was on my own. "You think you can just disappear a plane full of people?" I asked, keeping the operative's attention focused on me. "Do you have any idea how much money, how much political weight is on this flight? You aren't just kidnapping a VC, you're triggering a massive search and rescue operation that will leave no rock unturned. The internal security services will dismantle every single one of your cells within 48 hours. The operative laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You talk as if you're still the boss." "You're in our house now, and we've been waiting for you to get comfortable in 1A for months. The merger? The logistics company? That was just the tether to pull you into the net." The plane lurched as it descended rapidly, the cabin lights flickering and turning a deep, jarring red. Turbulence rocked the vessel, throwing passengers around, But the operative held her ground with unnatural balance. Suddenly, the intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't the pilot's voice. It was a digital, distorted tone, a pre-recorded message playing on a loop. T-minus 5 minutes to touchdown. Secure all loose items. Prepare for a non-standard landing. I looked out the window. The clouds had parted, revealing a desolate, rugged landscape of jagged mountains and endless, dark forest. There was no runway, just a clearing that looked like it had been carved out of the wilderness by heavy machinery. This was a private installation, an off-the-grid facility for the very criminal network I had been trying to expose. The consultant's wife suddenly lunged forward, trying to grab the operative's arm. It was a suicidal, frantic move. The operative reacted with lightning speed, shoving the woman back against the seat and leveling her weapon. "Don't touch me!" she snarled. In that split second of distraction, I saw my opening. I reached into my coat, feeling for the small, heavy object I always carried for emergencies. A high-frequency beacon that didn't just track location, but triggered a silent, high-priority distress signal to my private security contractor back in London. I had kept it hidden, even through the scanners. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the beacon. As the plane hit the ground with a bone-jarring, violent impact, the landing gear screaming in protest, I slammed the activation button. The cabin erupted into chaos. The lights died completely, plunging us into total darkness, and the plane skidded violently across the uneven terrain, the screech of metal on rock deafening. I felt the seatbelt dig into my chest as the plane finally slammed into a ridge and came to a grinding, terrifying halt. Silence followed, ringing and absolute. Then, I heard the heavy, metallic clanking of the emergency exit being forced open from the outside. Flashlights beamed through the dust, cutting through the dark like searchlights. But they weren't coming from the cockpit. They were coming from the woods. Then, a voice came over the speaker system, not the operatives, not the pilots, but a cold, familiar voice that made my blood run cold. It was the man I had fired 3 months ago, the one who had disappeared after the initial audit. "Welcome home, Mr. Investor," the voice echoed. "We've been waiting a long time to show you exactly what happens to people who try to bankrupt our business." I unbuckled my belt, prepared to fight, but as the smoke cleared, I saw them. Standing at the emergency exit, silhouetted against the flashlights, were not just guards. They were an entire team of heavily armed men, and they were pointing their weapons not at me, but at the operative who had hijacked the plane. The operative looked confused, her weapon wavering. "What is this?" she hissed. "A changing of the guard," a voice said from the shadows. And then a figure stepped into the light, holding a familiar, sleek device that looked exactly like the one I had just triggered. "He's mine," the figure said, pointing a steady finger directly at me. "And we are going to start the interrogation." The figure stepping into the light wasn't just an enemy. It was the former CFO of the company I had been rescuing, a man I had personally fired for discrepancies that I couldn't quite name at the time. Seeing him here, in the middle of a remote mountain clearing, was the final piece of the puzzle. The entire merger, the logistics company, the consultants I'd been dealing with, it was all a theater production designed to lead me into this exact trap. He didn't look like a disgruntled ex-employee anymore. He looked like the architect of a dark, sprawling enterprise. He stood amidst a dozen men who moved with the tactical precision of a paramilitary unit, their weapons aimed not at the ceiling, but at the operative who had just been holding us hostage. "Put it down," the CFO said, gesturing toward the operative with the weapon. "You were meant to bring him to the meeting point, not initiate a localized takeover. You've been greedy, and that's a dangerous trait in our organization." The operative, caught between the barrel of the CFO's men and the passengers, hesitated. Her hand shook for the first time. "He was going to call in a strike," she defended herself,
her eyes darting to me. "He had a signal device."
If I hadn't taken the plane, we'd all be in custody by now. He was supposed to be brought to us, not intercepted by your side deal, the CFO retorted, stepping over the debris of the plane's interior. He stopped in front of me, his shadow falling over my seat. He smelled of cold air and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the burning jet fuel and sweat filling the cabin. "It's been a long journey, hasn't it? You've been very diligent, digging into the ledgers, tracing the supply chains. You're the reason our specialized goods were delayed for weeks." "I was doing my job," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I kept my hand beneath the fold of the seat, fingers hovering over the override for the emergency tracking signal. I knew my private security would be arriving, but I had to buy time. "You thought you could hide an organized scheme behind a legitimate logistics merger. You were wrong. The audit is complete." The CFO chuckled, a sound that lacked any warmth. "The audit? You think the people who actually run this world care about your spreadsheets? You're not a visionary investor, you're just a pawn who happened to have too much liquidity. And now, you're going to help us move the rest of it." He gestured to his men. "Grab him, and the consultant. The wife stays here." Before I could move, the consultant let out a pathetic cry, trying to scramble over the seats. One of the guards backhanded him with the butt of his weapon, sending him sprawling into the aisle. The consultant's wife didn't even scream. She just watched, paralyzed by the sheer scope of the violence. "You're making a mistake," I said, standing up. I was outnumbered, but I wasn't defenseless. I had been training for this kind of scenario for years, ever since I first realized how dangerous the corporate world truly was. "You kill me, the money stops moving. You need my authorization codes to liquidate the assets you've been funneling. Without me, your organization is bankrupt by morning." The CFO paused, his hand inches from my collar. He looked at me, weighing the truth in my words. He knew I had set up multi-signature verification, a failsafe that required my biometric input to access the deepest layers of the company's capital. "You're right," he admitted slowly. "You are more valuable alive. For now." He signaled his men, and they began to drag us toward the jagged gash in the fuselage. As we stepped out into the night, the mountain air hit me with brutal force. It was freezing, the sky above a canvas of uncaring stars. Beyond the wreckage of the plane, a convoy of dark, unmarked SUVs waited, engines idling with a low, predatory hum. Just as they shoved me toward the nearest vehicle, a faint sound hummed in the distance, a high-pitched whine that grew into a rhythmic thrum. It wasn't the wind, it was the sound of rotors. My heart leaped. My security team was close. The CFO heard it too. He looked at the sky, his eyes hardening. "Change of plans," he snapped, drawing his own sidearm and pressing it against my temple. "They're here early. It seems your private security is more loyal than I anticipated." "They aren't here for a negotiation," I whispered, feeling the cold steel of the gun against my skin. "Neither are we," he snarled. He looked at his men and gave a sharp command. They turned, not toward the SUVs, but toward the perimeter of the clearing. They began to set up a defensive line, but not against the approaching helicopters. They were positioning themselves to use the passengers, the innocent people still huddled in the dark, as a shield. "Tell them to stand down," the CFO growled, shoving me toward the edge of the clearing where the pilot imposter was holding the flight attendant and the consultant's wife at gunpoint. "Tell them to turn back, or the first thing they see when they land will be the end of every witness on this field." I looked up, seeing the searchlights of the approaching helicopters sweep over the trees. I had a split second to make a choice. Call it off and hope for another chance, or force the confrontation and pray that my team's precision was as good as I paid for. I took a breath and shouted toward the sky, my voice booming across the clearing. "Do not engage! I repeat, do not engage!" The CFO smirked, his grip tightening. "Good, you're learning." But as he relaxed his guard for just a fraction of a second, I saw it. A small red laser dot flickering across his chest, originating from the dense tree line. My security had arrived, and they weren't just following my instructions. They had bypassed my order the moment they saw the hostages. The CFO followed my gaze just as his own men began to fall. But in the chaos, he didn't run. He grabbed me by the coat, dragged me toward the open SUV, and slammed the door shut, locking it from the inside. We were trapped in a steel box, and as the roar of the helicopters intensified, he pulled a detonator from his pocket. "You want to save the day?" he hissed, his face twisted in a mask of pure malice. "Then let's see how you do it when the entire area goes up in flames." He reached for the button, and the world outside the tinted windows turned into a blinding white inferno. The shockwave hit the SUV like a physical blow, rocking the vehicle onto two wheels before it slammed back into the frozen mud. The world outside turned into a kaleidoscope of orange and black, the wreckage of the plane, now engulfed in a secondary blast that the CFO had clearly prepared as a scorched earth contingency. Smoke billowed against the windows, thick and choking, momentarily blinding us from the chaotic firefight erupting outside. The CFO scrambled to unlock the door, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. He wasn't thinking about the money anymore. He was thinking about survival. He kicked the door open, the freezing mountain air rushing in, and tried to drag me out with him, using me as a human shield against the incoming tactical team. "They won't fire!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "They value your life too much. Tell them to back off." I didn't tell them to back off. I waited. I watched as the infrared sights from the tree line danced across the clearing with surgical precision. My security team wasn't just a group of guards. They were professionals who had been trained for exactly this type of hostile environment. They had anticipated the possibility of a secondary explosion and had positioned themselves on the high ground, out of the blast radius. As the CFO stepped out, dragging me into the freezing night, I didn't resist. I leaned my weight into him, momentarily unbalancing his grip on the sidearm. In that heartbeat of distraction, a series of muffled, rhythmic thwips echoed through the clearing, suppressed fire from a sniper positioned on the ridge. The CFO stumbled, his arm dropping as he took a hit to the shoulder. The gun clattered into the dirt. I didn't hesitate. I dropped into a low crouch, swept his legs with a swift, powerful motion, and pinned him into the mud before he could reach for the backup weapon tucked into his waistband. The adrenaline was a cold, sharp fire in my veins. "The merger is dead," I growled, pinning his face to the frozen earth. "And so is your group. I've already authorized the transfer of all encrypted records to the internal security services. Every account, every shell company, every consultant, they're all accounted for." He laughed, a wet, rattling sound, even as the tactical team swarmed the clearing. "You think you've won? You're a target now. They'll come for you. You can't stop the flow of that substance, and you can't stop the people who profit from it." "Maybe not," I replied as my head of security stepped into the light, securing the perimeter and cuffing the CFO with heavy-duty restraints. "But I can make sure you're the first one to face the consequences for the next few decades. There's a special place for people who try to turn a business into a crime scene." The rest of the night was a blur of efficiency. The innocent passengers, including the consultant and his terrified wife, were moved to a secure transport. They were shaken and battered, but they were alive. I watched as the authorities arrived, not just the local police, but the heavy hitters from the national agencies, the ones I had alerted the moment I triggered the beacon. By sunrise, the clearing was silent again. The fire had been extinguished, leaving only the charred skeleton of the plane. I stood on a small hill overlooking the site, watching as they loaded the CFO and his associates into armored transports. The consultant who had tried to steal my seat walked past me, his head bowed, his expensive suit ruined by the mud. He didn't look at me. He knew, as I did, that his life as he knew it had ended the moment he stepped onto that plane. A month later, the news cycle was ablaze. The logistics merger scandal had become the centerpiece of a massive, sweeping investigation. The organization I had uncovered was being dismantled piece by piece. My company, though bruised by the association, emerged stronger, having successfully purged the rot that had been festering in its mid-level operations. I was back in New York, sitting in a boardroom that looked almost identical to the one I had occupied before the flight. But this time, the chairs were empty. I didn't need consultants. I had learned the hard way that when you're at the top, the only people you can trust are the ones who have proven their loyalty under fire. My assistant stepped into the room, placing a cup of coffee on the table. "The merger documents are ready for final sign-off, sir. Everything is clean. The audits came back negative." I looked at the documents, then out the window at the skyline of the city. I was the biggest investor, the person holding the cards, but I was no longer the naive venture capitalist who thought a business deal was just about numbers. I had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had tried to pull me in. I picked up the pen and signed my name. The merger was done. The criminals were behind bars. And as I walked out of the building, I didn't take the elevator. I walked toward the lobby, my eyes scanning the room, my senses sharp. I was still the person in seat 1A, but I was no longer just a passenger. I was the one navigating the course, and I would never let anyone try to steal my seat again. The story of that flight would remain a cautionary tale in the industry, a reminder that when you try to break someone whose foundations are built on iron, you're the one who ends up shattered.